Good morning, welcome everyone. I'm so glad and honored to be here with these amazing speakers who are really inspirational for me. Last year I was here for the Road to COP30 event. We were still expecting to host COP30 in the Amazon in Belém. And it makes me really happy to see that we did not let the forest issue die after Belém. We know that we had the COP of the forest, but we know that the issue did not end there. We have a lot of work to do. Since then, times have become weirder all across the globe. So I think it's an even more urgent matter to be discussing the standing forest and how can we collaborate as civil society, as institutions, as foundations, as philanthropists, as entrepreneurs and social change makers to keep our forest standing. I talk about the Amazon, but we have other people here that will talk about their own tropical forests and their own forests that they are fighting to keep standing from different perspectives. So I am really, really excited to present you guys and to bring on the speakers that will be here with us today. First of all, I'm going to call up Vivek Maru, the founder and CEO of Namati. Please join us. You can sit here. And then I will call Emily Jacobi, the co-founder and executive director of Awana Digital. Please welcome Emily. Now I'm gonna invite here Dodo, the head of BRWA Foundation. Please join us, Dodo. And my fellow Brazilian colleague, Fabíola Zerbini, the executive director of Conexsus. Bem-vinda, welcome. So right now we're gonna talk about forests on the front line and the integrated solutions that we can have for a thriving future. I think all of us here in this room understand the importance of forests to our biodiversity, to our climate regulation, to carbon absorption, and to the communities that keep these forests standing. Let's not forget about them, who are in the center of all of these organizations' amazing work. I'm going to start with a question to Vivek about Namati's work. So Vivek, I want to ask you to explain a little bit about Namati's work for us, and how do you guys put the power of the law in the hands of communities so that grassroots communities can use the law in their favor to protect their territories and their rights.
Thank you so much, and it's awesome to be here. It's an honor to be here. Before I get to forests, actually, I'm an American citizen. I flew here from Washington, D.C. And it's always an honor to be among people from around the world. I just wanted to say that I believe that the war that the U.S. government is prosecuting in Iran is immoral and illegal. And when some of the most powerful people in the world are breaking laws so freely, it's not that crazy. It's not that surprising that many of us hold law in low regard. Many years ago, I told my grandmother that I was going to law school, and she did not skip a beat. She said, "Lawyer is liar." Which was discouraging. But especially now you can see the wisdom in her skepticism. So many people around the world, they experience law as an abstraction or a threat or a lie. And I have been on a quest for many years with people from all over to take law out of books and courtrooms and combine it instead with the other great asset we have, which is our own people power. And we do that through community paralegals. How many of you have heard of community paralegals? Have you heard that term before? Anyone? I see a hand or a few, okay. How many of you work with community paralegals, like actively on a day-to-day basis? They go by many names. Sometimes people call them barefoot lawyers. Sometimes people call them community justice workers. These are organizers who can be a bridge between law and the people who need it. And you might think of an analogy to community health workers where, which Skoll Foundation has done a lot to support, where community health workers help people get access to healthcare, community paralegals help people get access to law. And like community health workers are connected to doctors and a medical system, community paralegals need to be connected to lawyers and a sort of vertical network, but they have a different message from lawyers. Like a typical lawyer's message is, I'm gonna solve it for you. A paralegal's message is, we're gonna solve it together and get stronger in the process. And I'll just tell a story about what that looks like in practice. 2014, a European oil palm company secured a lease agreement for 75,000 acres of rainforest in eastern Sierra Leone for 50 years for $2 an acre per year. And they signed this agreement 4 hours from the land in question, behind closed doors. The guy who signed it was an interim paramount chief who was appointed by the government, who wasn't even from this place, and he thumbprinted it because he was illiterate. And he had not asked the consent of the about 20,000 people who live in this place. One of those 20,000 is this woman named Mrs. Binta Jallo. She was born and raised there. During the Sierra Leone Civil War, she had fled as a refugee to Guinea on foot. And when she heard about this, she was like, I don't want to be a refugee again. I don't want to lose my home. Mrs. Jallo is from a traditional Muslim family, so she was never sent to school, and she also actually never learned to read, something she regrets. But she knows how to fight, and she got organized. She organized a residents association. They reached out to a pair of community paralegals. And the paralegals, Bendu Koroma, Tommy Abdullahi, the first thing they did was they got a hold of the lease agreement, which is registered in Freetown, and they translated it into terms that people could understand, from English to the local language, but also from legalese, because that's a language in and of itself. And it was very clear when they looked at that side by side with what they knew about Sierra Leonean land law, that there were a number of violations in the contents of the agreement and in the process by which the agreement was secured. And we never went to court in this case. The communities, armed with that information, they confronted the traditional authorities, they confronted the company, they demonstrated en masse, and it took about 18 months. But the company ended up backing down and acknowledging that that lease agreement was invalid. And land grabs are happening all the time, all over the world, but reversals of land grabs are rare. This was a big deal. Mrs. Jallo said, I learned that no one can bend my hand, no one can take my land. I learned my rights. It got complicated after that, though, because Mrs. Jallo's section of the community, they had a partnership with something called the Gola Rainforest Park, and they just wanted to say no. They didn't want an oil palm plantation. Mrs. Jallo had traveled to Liberia. She had seen how destructive oil palm is. It's monocropping, one single tree, destroying the rainforest and planting a single tree. They just wanted to say no. Paralegals helped them say no. They won. Another portion of the community said, actually, we would welcome an oil palm plantation if it could be on terms that we agree to. And I think this is reflective of a broader reality, which is that communities living in forests, just like any community, my community in Washington, D.C., they are not homogenous. They're heterogeneous. And I think we do them a disservice and ourselves a disservice if we oversimplify them or romanticize them. The paralegals don't have a preset agenda. So the ones who said, well, actually, we would welcome a plantation, they helped them to negotiate a fair agreement. And if you compare the agreement they ended up with the one they started with, it is night and day. The final agreement was less than 1/10 the size, 5,000 acres rather than 75,000 acres. Final agreement, the rent payment went up by 250%. The final agreement added a profit sharing agreement, 5% profit sharing agreement, which was not there in the original. We added environmental protections related to forest fires and chemical use, and most importantly, it was signed in an open community meeting rather than behind closed doors. That is the difference that legal empowerment can make. There are so many cases like that, though, and working case by case can feel like bailing water from the ocean with a tin can. Like if you look over here at the buckets you're filling up with your can, or you're like, okay, 1 bucket, 2 bucket, I'm making progress. But if you face forward, the ocean of injustice can be overwhelming. And so everywhere we work, we deploy community paralegals in 7 countries. We convene something called the Grassroots Justice Network with members in over 180 countries. And everywhere, what we try to do is build from specific cases to changes in the laws and systems that make injustice possible. And in Sierra Leone, we worked over a 10-year period on 300 cases like Mrs. Jallo's. And not all of them were successful. We won some, we lost some, but we brought people together across those different cases to compare notes on how the system was working in practice and to start envisioning what a better system would look like. Mm-hmm. And those conversations led to a movement that envisioned a law called the Customary Land Rights Act. And that law passed in 2022. It was covered in the New York Times and the BBC. It's one of the most progressive land laws in the world. It guarantees the right to free, prior, informed consent of communities across the country over any industrial activity that happens on their territory. It forbids industrial development in old-growth forests. It empowers local land use committees and require that they be 1/3 women. There's a kind of patriarchal tradition in Sierra Leone in many places where they say, land business na man business, meaning land affairs are for men to handle. Requiring that the committees be 1/3 women is a way of pushing back against that patriarchy. That law would never have been passed without the leadership of these people who had been tackling problems in their own places. So we like to think of it as a cycle. Know law, use law, shape law. You can know and use rules that exist, imperfect as those rules may be, to fight against the land grab, to try to secure enforcement of an existing agreement, to get legal tenure over your lands, as many communities have done in Indonesia. And then you can build from that experience of knowing and using the rules we have to shaping better rules and systems. Know law, use law, shape law. Maybe we could actually say it together. Know law, use law, shape law. Ready? Know law, use law, shape law. We want everybody to be able to do those three things, no matter who you are, no matter where you were born, no matter what station. It can be scary, and right now it can be dangerous, and yet it's worth doing. I have seen this wheel of legal empowerment, the legal empowerment cycle of knowing and using and shaping the law. I've seen it turn in even very difficult places, and it represents a deeper version of democracy. I think many people around the world today experience the law as broken, and they're right. The law is broken. But if we know it, we can use it, and if we use it, we can fix it. Thank you, guys.
I love it. I love to hear that, Vivek, because in Brazilian Amazon, land grabbing is one of the most threatening issues that we face right now. And even though in Brazil's case, we have a really important constitution that was shaped in 1988, but even though we have this important and really amazing constitution, we still face difficulties in accessing those rights and guaranteeing the constitution to be respected. And usually these communities do not have access to the right of law, and they cannot make the law in their favor. Usually because lawmaking is a tool that is really inaccessible, another language that we do not really can relate to. But it's really inspirational to hear your experience. And I think it relates also to Awana Digital's experience because they use another tool as a way to empower and guarantee rights of the communities that keep the forest standing, which is technology. So when we talk about law and when we talk about technology, we often see as languages that are far away from us. And how can we make it closer to the communities and accessible to the communities so that they can use it in their favors of their territories and their rights? So I'm going to ask Emily to share with us a little bit of Awana Digital's experience and how do they use tech as a tool for protection of the territories and the lives of the people who live in the forest.
Yeah, thank you so much. And what a perfect segue, because I think when I think about forests, and I think all of us do, we think about people because they're inextricably linked. And the Amazon, which is the tropical forest that I know the most, I'm not from the Amazon. I live in the United States and am of European descent. But and our team is very global, and including folks based in the Amazon. Speaking of technology, so we work in digital technology, and the law was, I think, one of the first tools that was used as a tool of colonization and dispossession. And the right, the European powers, as they spread all over the world, claimed claimed these lands as theirs, even though they weren't. And so, that's a horrible history. And we know that. We don't need to go into all the details. But the Amazon's vastness did protect a lot of it from being fully conquered. So we're talking about places where, and I think this is also true in parts of the Congo and Indonesia, where there are still people who are, in voluntary isolation, choosing to stay away, choosing to reject technology, to reject modern technology, to reject the law and so on. And that's a really fundamental right that is upheld by the UN, but not always, in threat and territory. But technologically, I want to actually say is technology is very broad, and there's so many different technologies, and a lot of people don't know that the Amazon itself was actually co-created by humans, and Daniela could probably speak to this very deeply, but the rich soil of the Amazon was formed over thousands of years by humans, gardening essentially, and planting food plants like cassava and sweet potato and pepper plants. And so what, maybe to the Western eye looks like, untouched landscape is actually this really beautiful co-creation. And so I want to acknowledge that technology and technological innovation actually is everywhere that humans are. And sometimes the most sustainable technologies, well, arguably almost all of the most sustainable technologies, are still actually being maintained and upheld by indigenous peoples of local communities. And so we came in as an ally organization. Members of our team, I had worked in I was an accidental technologist. I think maybe kind of your approach to law is my approach to technology. I was, in my early 20s and during the time of the launch of Facebook and Google and so on, and it was transforming the lives of my friends, but I also was doing work with refugees and hearing how it was transforming their lives. And so co-founded the organization really as a tool to just help support local organizations to harness technology and to use it safely and securely and in a way that was defending their rights. And then other members of our team had worked in the Amazon for a long time supporting participatory mapping. And participatory mapping is a beautiful, amazing approach and technology that Dodo can speak even more to, but it is one that on the digital side has often required outside experts. Some of the tools require multiple years of expertise to use to create these maps. And so our team, we came together with a question of, is it possible to actually, as new digital technologies are evolving, to create a tool that would be easy enough to use, work completely offline in territory, and actually where the data could be completely gathered, maintained, controlled by the community, and then they could, a lot of the same principles you talked about, they could decide how and when they want to share it. What kind of maps do they want to create? What kind of data do they want to gather? And it was an experiment. So one of our first partners were the Waorani people of Ecuador, and they're one of the smallest indigenous nations in Ecuador, but one of the largest territories, 1 million acres. And really proud, amazing traditions, still speaking Huaturero, their local language, and very fiercely have defended their territory from rubber plantations and multiple waves of invasion. But they'd seen neighboring communities that had been devastated by oil drilling. And in the 1990s, actually, in the eastern part of the Waorani territory, they were kind of tricked into signing oil agreements by American missionaries, and it had just devastated their communities. So we were approached by some amazing partners, Alianza Sebo, an alliance of 4 different indigenous nationalities in Ecuador, and Amazon Frontlines, an amazing ally organization also doing amazing legal work and legal empowerment work. And they came to us and said, can we work with you to support a mapping initiative? So the very first version of our tool that's now called Comapeo, they called it Mapeo Sebo, and they started actually gathering this data. They created hundreds of icons of the plants, the animals, the different sacred sites that they wanted to map, and village by village, literally every individual in 500,000 acres worked together on a map that was theirs. And it wasn't just about the map, it was actually about the power that was built through the process. And they came to us, one of the things they said is we want to create a map of things that don't have a price. And we want to show that our territory, because on government maps, it just looks like vast green territory. There are very few villages, but it's not. And you know that actually every single part of their territory is walked by their hunters. And the women know where the sacred sites are and where the medicine is grown. And together, the elders and the young people working together, they could create this comprehensive map of their territory. And so when the Ecuadorian government announced a new oil concession that, similar to your story, had been signed by one leader in a community that had been told, well, we'll bring you schools and we'll bring you healthcare and so on in exchange for the entire territory having oil drilling, they had actually built the people power to decide to launch a legal case. So my friend Namati and Kimo, she's actually written a book about this, her whole story, but includes part of this story. They launched a legal campaign, and they already had tenure, but they didn't have the rights. They had to argue that the oil concession had been named illegally, and they ended up winning in the regional court, and then the Supreme Court upheld it. And it was a groundbreaking case because, as you said, it's so much harder to actually defend against extractive industries, and they were able to do that. So we were very yeah. So 500,000 acres protected from oil extraction, and most importantly, that indigenous rights and their decision over how they wanted their territory to evolve was upheld. And they've continued, and then our tool also evolved. We worked with multiple partners, first in Ecuador and Peru, now also Brazil, Kenya, and just starting in Indonesia. We've been co-designing the tools. So the tool Comapeo, it's actually just been out, the new version's just been out for the past year, but in 2025, communities across almost 10 million hectares of land across the tropics have been using the tool to ongoing monitor, map, and defend their territories. Another example, and I'm not quite sure where I am on time.
No, you can.
Good. Okay, great. Another example, we're working in an amazing part of Brazil. We were actually brought in by Niatero, who's doing amazing trust-based funding for indigenous groups. And then we're collaborating with a couple other technology partners, Conservation Metrics, that's building a tool, a platform for indigenous data sovereignty for collecting information. And then Amazon, which pulls in satellite imagery to do alerts for where there's deforestation. So we're a coalition of groups working together to support Univaja. And Univaja is the indigenous-led organization of the Javari River Valley. The Javari River Valley is 8.5 million acres. That's approximately the size of, I believe it's close to the state of Georgia in the United States or the country of Austria. And there's 19 different indigenous peoples living there, but only about 7,000 people. So you think vast territory, but and a huge number of language diversity, maybe one of the most language diverse areas of the world, but they're facing incredible threats because they're on the triple border between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, and there's drug trafficking, there's poaching, and so over the past few years, with outside support but indigenous vision, Univaja has created this amazing monitoring system, and Comapeo has allowed them now they have a fleet of boats with Starlink on them, and they go out, they collect the data, and then they sync it through the internet connection to their headquarters. And so they've been able to reduce by 300% the number of threats that they've documented in the past 2 years.
Awesome.
It's huge. So yeah, I think I'll wrap by saying that thank you for apologizing. I'm also a U.S. citizen. Thank you for apologizing for the many illegal actions of our government. I also think digital technology right now is being led by unscrupulous companies that are assisting in the final frontiers of colonization, not just natural resources, not just indigenous people's territories, but also our minds and our attention. And so I feel really that it's important as a technology. We all can do things to support tropical forests, but we also, I think, should be trying to defend against that final frontier of colonization, and should be defending a world in which many different cultures and languages and territories can exist, and where people have the right to decide for themselves. And so I think by co-building technology that's rooted in those values, we're trying to ensure actually the world that we want to see, and a world that works for everybody, including the communities that defend forests. And I'm very proud that we've played a small part in a tool that came from the vision of the Amazon and is now supporting communities in many other places and being used by them. So, yeah.
Emily, before I pass on to Dodo, I just wanted to comment 2 things hearing you talk about Awana Digital's experience. One of the things is that in Brazil, a lot of communities, indigenous communities, quilombolas communities, are gaining access to internet over the last 2 years. And it's been a long debate amongst the movements of the impact of the internet reaching those communities. And in one of those debates, one indigenous leader that I really admire, her name is Alana Montineri. She's from COIAB, which is the coordination of indigenous organizations of the Brazilian Amazon. Alana raised her hand and said, for me, technology is being able to get a message from my fellow colleague that is going to the last community of the Rio Negro. When she reaches her home, she can say, I arrived safely. And for me, that makes a lot of difference. And I say that because, of course, the internet reaching communities that have not access to internet until now, it's something that we should discuss because we've seen the effect that the internet can have in all of our lives. But it's also a right to information, a right to report threats, a right to access rights, and how can we shape with these communities the use of this internet. And the other thing that came up to my mind, hearing you say about technology, and not only modern technology, but traditional technology, it's another person from Brazil, from Alana Institute, that said one time, and it got stuck to me, that people often ask in Brazil, like, where are pyramids? We have pyramids from Mayas, Aztecas, Incas in other countries, and we don't have pyramids in Brazil. Where are they? And then he says, our trees are pyramids. We have trees as old as pyramids, and we have them because people kept them standing. It's not something that happened naturally. So it kind of changed my perspective also of the importance, the historical importance of those trees too, that tell the country's history, and often are seen as something that it's natural, that is just there, but it's there because for centuries people have been fighting to keep them standing in these forests. And with this note, I'm gonna pass on to Dodo and ask him to tell us about the importance of the solutions that want to see forests thriving and standing to put people in the center. We often see forests in a really far away perspective as only a natural, vast place with trees and animals, and we forget the communities that live on those territories and that usually risk their lives to keep this forest standing. And I'm gonna ask Dodo to tell us about why is it important to have solutions that center people, and how does BRWA Foundation work to make this happen?
Okay, thank you. So I will starting about the community mapping mentioned by Emily, because in Indonesia we have a long experience with the community mapping. Maybe 1992 we starting with the community mapping. Some organization to make their methodology to approach to strengthening about the indigenous rights. But until 2010, we don't know how many indigenous people get mapped, how the status of recognition. So with the technology, we try to develop the platform, the BRWA platform, with the scheme of the registration and verification the data in the fields. We can completely document the spatial and social data, because the mapping is the subject, is communities, and also the object is the indigenous territory. And also the mapping, we can, identification of the relation, about the conservation, about the management, about the sacred areas, and how the governance, how the law, the customary law to protect this area. So with this platform, BRWA in 2010 to develop the guideline about the registration process, because our government in Indonesia, there's still no the scheme to registration of indigenous territory. So with this 5 organizations in Indonesia, we developed BRWA, or Ancestral Domain Registration Agency. This is the platform to register indigenous territory. In with this platform, we can navigating about how the indigenous people already have the map and clear between community. Because the very important in the community mapping, this is the overlapping boundary claim. So with this process, we can try discussion with the indigenous people to make sure about the recognition by others. This very important recognition, it is recognition by others before we continue with the legal recognition by the government. This is the very important to completely all document the history, the governance, but the tenure, and also about the biodiversity in the indigenous territory. So with this platform, we are also navigating about the status recognition. In my constitution, this already the indigenous people get rights, but the administration is the challenge. The administration process, because the government is not yet, department or institution to make the administration of indigenous people and territory. So this platform can help the government in the central government, in the province and district government to identification, to verification and administration about the information, the spatial mapping, and also the social data. So we can, every year, navigating, that province already recognition the indigenous people, how many peoples, how many indigenous territory, and how many hectare. And also about the Kashmir forest in the central government. And the third about this platform, we can provide the comprehensive data of the spatial and social data. For what? For the spatial planning. Mm-hmm. The spatial planning is like the bridging to economic development. Because with this spatial planning, the indigenous people, they can, how they manage their territory. Mm-hmm. This is very important because the identification about the potentials in the forest, in the carbon maybe, and the biodiversity, and also about the commodity like cacao, coffee, and etc. And this is the document, the spatial planning is like the communicating tools for indigenous people to another stakeholders, the government, maybe social entrepreneur like you. It's very important to the data, the document. And discussion about this is agree, but no, in the somewhere this is very important to APIC process to make the economic development. And I think with the comprehensive validating data, we can contribute to tenurial security and also to sustaining tenure to economic development. Thank you, Fabio.
I love this too. I think that there's a lot of similarities with Brazil, and your experience matches both of these experiences because you use technology of mapping to guarantee access to rights and land tenure. So I think there's a lot of intersectionality between our organizations and institutions kind of work. And hearing you, Dodo, led me to ask Fabíola. Fabíola is also Brazilian, so I've known her for more time. And she works and leads Conexsus. And I wanted to explain a little bit about Conexsus' work and also tell us how is it important to bring economic prosperity to these communities? Because we know there's a lot of economical interests facing and threatening these territories, but we also know that these communities need to have livelihoods and dignity and rights, and there's a lot of economic issues that they face. How can we work together with these communities to make it possible for them to have prosperity, even though they are sustaining the forest and keeping the forest alive? How those two things complement themselves and are not a fight between protection of the forest and economic development?
Yeah. Thanks, Daniela. Thanks a lot, Skoll, and my colleagues here. I know it's a great honor and responsibility, also ahead of the COP30, but also in the current the geopolitical current context now. Yeah. We need to keep talking about forests. We need to keep talking about people who live on the forest. No, this cannot be continued as a marginal topic or discussions inside this kind of meetings and convenings, but also in our houses, with our families, with our kids. No, everybody needs to keep talking. Even more us that came from a country where forest is, like what we identify ourselves. No, I live in the south of the country, but I still feel myself as a forest people, and understanding the differences, between who have born there, but the importance of, keep talking on that. And the first thing is that prosperity, forest is not in opposition of economy. This needs to be restated, and not only because the model, the land use model and the economic development model that are still being incentivized, unfortunately do not really consider this in the center, in the heart. But economy is the way, is the middle, is not the end. The end is what that kind of economy or that the way that you are approaching economic models, or what kind of economic model are you incentivizing? The impact is the important. It's what really matters. So this is why we call like social bioeconomy. This is the agenda that we work for. That's just like put a signal, a social impact, a bio impact, or an environmental impact into the economy, into the trade relations, into the food production, into medicines, into even beyond that. So I think social bioeconomy first is a way to combine prosperity and sustainability with economy. And we have in the forest countries, and I think this is one thing that it's a common ground for all the tree basins and all the tropical forests is on the sense of the topic that we are discussing here. Social bioeconomy means really brings indigenous people, local communities, smallholders, family agricultors into some economic governance situation so bringing the indigenous territories, bringing the settlements, bringing the conservation units or reserves, depending the way that you call, as a territories that can be protected and at the same time produce richness, and livelihood and etc. And bring the models that we know so far, even the traditional models, like the ancestrality knows how to use forest without like the forest. But you can bring agroforestry, agroecologic, sustainable forest management, agro-extractivism in Brazil. Agro-extractivism looks like a dangerous word, but in Brazil we have sustainable agro-extractivism. How to bring the how, the who, the where, and this is what we call like social bioeconomy into the center of the discussions in terms of when we are talking about this. And Conexsus, we really could show that by, for instance, we have now more than 200 community-led businesses. It's cooperatives, associations that are formed by indigenous people, smallholders, and that are using the conservation units, indigenous territories for some economical reasons. And by working with this, in the past 7 years, we have more than 1.5 million hectares conserved. We have an increase of the revenue for them in a merge of 20% per year. And we are providing inputs for many different kind of supply chains. And if you look to a specific case, we have an arrangement that we call like a rubber financial arrangement. It's a connection between Michelin as a buyer, 15 community-led businesses, rubber, agro-extractivists, sustainable agro-extractivists, organized by Memorial Chico Mendes. Chico Mendes is a very important, person for everything that we are talking here, and he was an agro-extractivist, on the rubber supply chain, and WWF and us, we could increase in 8% the productivity by providing a commercial arrangement that it's also supported by sustainable crediting or green finance, but on this kind of we call like a finance of proximity. So trust finance or something that you build together, that you know. So we do, again, we do how to make, but it's not only about the rubber financial agreement, not only about ASPROC is the name of the organization that I was trying to bring as an example of this arrangement. It's not only about Conexsus, no? It's not only about GDP, no? The positive economic externalities of this model are huge. So if you put in the table what you are not wasting because you are all the crises around water, around climate, around biodiversity loss, and the people, the social inequality, the health, the problems on the health because of an unsustainable model. If you put on the equation all of this negative externalities of the current model that we have, land use and economic, you will see that the real value of the social bioeconomy is, okay, it's about ASPROC, it's about the community-led businesses, but it's more, it's about the real, I think all of us, the win that all of us will have, and also a kind of an existing possibility, for a survival possibility. So the model is already proved. We do have concepts, like all around the world, not only in Brazil, not only because of Conexsus, and we do have others, thankful, like working on the same agenda. But the social bioeconomy, the way that I'm framing here, is still completely under-incentivized. Is still almost invisible into the macroeconomic, and is still mostly undervalued. So how to really, really look at it in a way that, okay, it's not only an issue of scale, but it's also an issue of visibility. And by putting this on the center of discussions, then the philanthropies, together with companies, together with us, together and with and from the communities, the territories that really has the answer, and fostering public policies and global commitments that really could bring prosperity and like forest into the center of the economy as a way to have a good life, not only to have things, but have a good life and as humanity.
Fabíola, I love to hear you. It reminds me of two things also. The first one, I was going to mention Chico Mendes. I'm glad you did it. Because actually in English it seems kind of weird, the word agri-extractivism. But in Brazil it is a way of protecting, of protected areas. We have extractive reserves. And they came up with Chico Mendes' work and legacy. I assume that most of you know Chico Mendes as one of our biggest environmental leaders, but it's great to remember him as this person that from the beginning he was working with rubber in the middle of the forest, and then he understood that the forest destruction was something that could put his livelihood on risk, and afterwards he understood that it could put the forest at risk. So Chico Mendes had the really beautiful action of dialoguing with other forest people. So he created back then the People's Alliance with indigenous leaders, quilombolas leaders, to talk about the protection of the forest and their own livelihoods inside the forest. And I think up to this day, he's a big reference for all of us in Brazil that work with forest protection. And the other thing that I was going to mention is that I remember Tishai Surui, who is also an indigenous leader from Brazil, from the state of Rondônia, a friend and inspiration for me also. And I was talking with her some time ago when she was saying that one of her main issues right now in her territory is how to keep the youth inside the territory and keep them from leaving the territory and going to big cities. And that she thinks that the economic prosperity of the population is the key. If they don't have ways of guaranteeing livelihoods and guaranteeing dignity and rights to those youth inside the territories, it's more likely for them to leave. So they are creating, in Paita Surui's people, different ways of creating economic prosperity. It can be with social bioproducts. It can be with tourism, for instance. They created the first indigenous tourist agency in Brazil, which is a really, really big deal and can serve as inspiration for a lot of other peoples in the country. So I think that looking at forests and trying to create with these communities solutions so that they can keep living in the forest and not putting their lives at risk by doing it, it's something that all of us as changemakers, philanthropists, and consumers can do to help keep the forest standing. I'm gonna now open for all of you for questions or remarks. We're gonna pass, it's gonna be one by one. So my friend is gonna pass the mic. Yes, I wanted to hear from you, so I'm glad you are the first one to talk.
Thank you. Very good morning, and thank you for these amazing sessions. My name is Juan Carlos Hintiach. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Alliance Indigenous Territorial. Members organizations from Indonesia, from Brazil, the Pibi, Coyabe, Amazon Basin, Coica, almost 1 billion hectares that is in our hands. Hearing what the lawyer was speaking on technology and what the challenges, realistically speaking, we are in the center. We live there in our territories. We are there. I just want to connect in 2 points here. In Ecuador, we win the referendum to keep the oil under the surface. So what else we need to do it? We believe in the Constitution. We have a collective rights in the Constitution. But we win the referendum, but it's a context problem that we need to find a new ways how to work together and to challenge that to the government. Going back to the economy, I think so that is the future for the generations are coming. Elders giving all the life, in the front, giving the life. Who is going to manage or plans or laboratory? My kids, generations. So that's why we need to analyze. I'm sorry I have to run. You know how is this situation, and really, really appreciate this. Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you very much.
I'm gonna pass on to Vivek to comment. I'm gonna have a comment also.
Yeah. Ecuador's constitution is incredible if anyone hasn't paid attention to it. Yeah, I think law is this dance where, you were mentioning that it was often the tool of repression and colonialism, and that's just often been the case throughout history, and yet it is one of the few things we have to protect rights, to constrain power, to govern our economy. And so part of what we're trying to do is not give up on law, but reclaim it. And reclaiming it looks like the people whose lives are at stake actually being able to wield it themselves. And so that focus on legal empowerment, I think, is just really crucial for people all over the world.
Yeah, I think that in Brazil we have also a recent experience which shows the importance of law. Actually, on the other side, unfortunately, we have recently Marco Temporal's bills was approved in Brazil. I don't know if any of you have heard about it, but it's actually one of the worst laws that Brazil could have approved. It's actually unconstitutional. Our Supreme Court has ruled it to be unconstitutional, so there's a big fight between Congress and the Supreme Court right now going on around this subject. But it's basically trying to reverse Brazil's constitution and indigenous rights to territories and make it harder, possibly impossible, to guarantee tenure rights for indigenous peoples in Brazil. And why I'm saying that, I think that people who want to destroy the forest understand the power of law and are really organized and well-funded to reverse laws that keep the forest protected or that guarantee traditional communities' rights to their territories. And on our side, we also need to be well-funded 100%. And well-organized to use the law on our favor and to change the law when it's not on our favor. It's something that Amazônia de Pé is doing right now. We are working towards a public demand bill, which is also a way of putting the rule of law in the hands of the people and trying to build a grassroots law in Brazil about public forests. So I think that using law as a tool, it's been used by both sides, and we have to have more strength in our side to make law work for us. So that's my remark around it, and I'm gonna open for other people who want to comment or have questions.
Thank you very much for the session. It's really interesting. I'm Yasmin Walji. It's great to hear about the discussion on law and the power of law. I'm a partner at a major international law firm who leads the free legal advice practice for social entrepreneurs across the world. And I've got two things to say. The first is we've been working with the Wildlife Trust in the UK with insurers to finance the protection and restoration of the temperate rainforest. And it's been an interesting example of business taking a long-term view of investment in the protection of biodiversity. The contract that we created, the financing contract, is 100 years. Is to span 100 years, which is really unique. And I think that's a really interesting example of how there are some businesses that will have that kind of long-term commitment to build in. And unfortunately, we need more of them. But the question I really wanted to ask was, you're talking about mapping and the data that you're getting from all the mapping. That's a very valuable resource. Mm-hmm. And I can see there's a tension between allowing that as open source so everyone can use it, but at the same time, it actually has a value to those communities, to the indigenous communities. And I wondered whether you had found a way of protecting that data because of its potential for value for others who might be less scrupulous in the way in which they use it. Yeah.
Well, I love the question. I think Emily can...
Yeah, thank you. Very, very on-spot question. And so... Yeah, and I'm sure we all have thoughts on so our fundamental commitment, and truly, I think the only reason that Indigenous people want to work with us and why we've had growth is because fundamentally all of our tools and our commitment is Indigenous data sovereignty from the get-go. And so the way the tool was developed from the beginning is that all the data is stored locally. It can be synced between devices amongst a trusted group, so a trusted group can shares that data, and it's entirely theirs to control and manage. And so you're right about that tension. And yes, tons of people hear technology, they're like, great, can you get it up into our database? And it's like, no, especially in the context of Indigenous peoples and their sacred information. And there's so many examples I've seen of when sacred information is shared, sometimes to even try to protect rights. In the Dakota access pipeline, there was a big fight over that, however many years ago in the United States, and the Lakota people were trying to protect their territory from this oil pipeline. And an example is they went to the local office, to the government office, to say where some burial sites were, because those should be absolutely protected against the oil pipeline. And the company then went the very next day, they skipped ahead 5 miles and they bulldozed those sites because they were more willing to pay the fine than have their pipeline be prevented from being able to move forward. And so I share that example because I think it's a very vivid one, but it's not, there's thousands of, maybe millions of examples of that kind of behavior. So I think Indigenous language, Indigenous maps, Indigenous knowledge is so important to protect. And I think as a technologist, we have a commitment to data sovereignty being first and foremost. But then it's a little more complicated because data sovereignty also means that a community should be able to share that data with the groups they want. And that is sovereignty, right? To be able to make choices, but are those informed choices? Because the internet's very complicated. I mean, most of us aren't making informed choices of how our data is shared on the internet. We're caught in an ecosystem that's constantly. So I think that's also why we work in collaboration with other technologists. We're trying to always understand. And then we have some amazing trainers on our team who do really great workshops in territory of how data is shared online. When you send a WhatsApp, here's how the information goes all the way up to a satellite and then comes back. Whereas if you're sharing the decentralized data like our tools are built on, you can just share directly. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of it is the education. But then there is a question of when a group decides to share their data, as they often do, and they need to for various reasons. Can they do that in an informed way? Do they have the ability? And then there's amazing Indigenous technologists in North America and Aotearoa and New Zealand who are working on the consent models and things like local context tagging for protection and consent and so on. So there's a whole ecosystem of people working on Indigenous data. But I think when it comes to forest communities who are often using tech, very new, the vast number of those people are new to technology. I mean, you already explained the situation with internet's very complex. It's a lot about education and kind of awareness so people can make informed choices.
Perfect. If Fabíola or Dodo want to comment, please feel free.
Just one, but you are the guy. No, I know you are the guy. Just a few words. Like we have an impact monitoring system to evaluate, how the activities like businesses, accessory, market access, finance, etc., are really helping to get the social and environmental impacts that in the end is the final goal. This is based on a self-declaration from the community-led business, with the community-led businesses. And we only use data in a combined way, but the beauty is that they do receive their own report to be used in their own relationships with potential impact investors or buyers or others. I think, and we are now trying to more and more combine it with the official and even not only official, like mapped biomas, other kind of scientific data to combine such a qualified qualitative data, self-declared, but also with the things that are being monitored in a broader perspective, deforestation, social inequality, hunger, and many other indicators that are so important. But again, also allowing them to participate into the monitoring system. I think this can work for indigenous, can work for smallholders, can work for. I think this is a way also to use this not only as a tool to prove to our investors, but as a tool also to empower them in the use of research, data, and in a qualified way also improve their how they can negotiate with their own ecosystem communities, etc. But please, you are the specialist.
Okay, thank you. So in the BRWA platform, we have the guideline and procedure to register with the APIC process. So in the first time, when the indigenous people send the data to BRWA, but the mapping, the shape file, that's the dangerous data, we keep it in the platform and not share for everyone, but it's the special thing for the recognition by the government. In the APIC process, we explain to the indigenous people about the process completely document. We discuss maybe 2 days, 3 days to completely document to explain about the consequence, about use the data for the recognition for the economic development. And if already in our platform, so it is submit to public, just the boundary, not detailing the data, like land use, this is no, just boundary. Because if maybe some colleagues, some partner or the government, if need the detailing, we can consultation with the indigenous people direct. Okay, this is can use to sharing and etc. Yeah, this is very tight for in BRWA to protect this data. Because not only about our commitment by the government, but in Indonesia also the security, but the intelligence and etc. is very dangerous for BRWA to share the data to public. So this is very important in the first time when APIC process we can explain to indigenous people about the consequences about the registration, yes. And also this is the collaboration because they have the knowledge about the territory, the information. So this is collaborating with BRWA and indigenous people to completely all document. Yeah, this is the procedure in BRWA, and every year we are release the data every March to indigenous people occurring in Nusantara in BRWA in Indonesia, and also the indigenous people. Indigenous people words about the data we release to the status of indigenous people rights. So this is very important for the public. How the commitment of the government, because we know forests are actually part of the living space of indigenous people. This is the territory of life. Yeah, this is very important to safeguard of not only about the production, this is about the culture. The culture of the indigenous people, about the manage with the ACCA, we call it the indigenous people and conserve area. We have documenting, this is 23 million hectares indicative the ACCA in the indigenous territory register in BRWA. So this is very important if we look to how the indigenous people knowledge about the conservation. I think this is the good if we can support, we can protect about the biodiversity in their territory. So this is process in BRWA, the APIC in the first time and publish. If any need about the data, we need consultation again for the community. Thank you.
Opening again for you. It's over there, and afterwards there, and after the three.
Thank you. Last week, our team is in gathering with local, in isolated initial contact actually, in Hongana Manyawa in North Maluka, that now is in their territories inside the map, the nickel mining owned by French government and China, Xingshan, etc. And then now our team is in, it is Hongana Manyawa in North Maluka, and now our team is in Gorontalo in Sulawesi, trying to find out how to map of another initial contact is Polahi people, because in this Polahi people areas now exists biomass concession owned by Wilmar, and then the trading to Japan, etc. We have in Auriga, we do mapping, we have biomass, etc. But we also have drones, etc. So my question actually to Emily, and do you have a kind of idea, a kind of a discussion of how far we can go with technology to this community? Not only save files, but also another information. Is there a kind of boundaries that we can develop or exploit, or is there safeguard for them before we bring out the information? Because we also have ideas to kind of develop a kind of online platform to tell their story. But sometimes, even though we tell their story, we think that we are doing the right things, but I can see also at the same time companies doing opposite, working with so-called community members as well. So is there boundaries here? Thank you. Or safeguard?
Great question.
I would love to talk with you longer. But yeah, it's so complicated. Thank you for what you're doing. I think it's so important and so meaningful. And I think I really do need to talk to you longer to give you a full answer. But briefly, I would say that you are not alone. I think there are many groups, the Guarani of Ecuador, the Univaja in Brazil, and many others who are holding that tension of interacting with the outside world and being the front lines of protecting, voluntary isolated people, and that tension can sometimes result in bloodshed. I mean, it can be, it's a really dangerous position that people are willing to take because they know how important it is. So I do think maps and stories can play such an important role, but you're right, like how do you tell the story of people who don't even want contact with the outside world? And how do you do that in a way that protects them? So I think it is about like this bigger ecosystem of like, it's not also just on you, like what do all of us need to do to help prevent, the extraction of an area that would ruin an entire worldview and way of living. So yeah, I do think you're right. Maps can play an important role, and like sometimes satellite and other maps where you're not physically going there can be really helpful. Our tool integrates with those things, but is more for like on the ground stuff. But I also will say I am seeing, you mentioned young people and elders. I think technology can be a great way to actually show a path of livelihood locally, and that, it just integrates to all these things. And like Vivek, I think we want to use the technology in a good way, not allow it to keep being in a bad. So longer conversation I would love to have, yeah.
I think we already have a coffee set up for after the event. Someone here, and then there was another person there, and I think someone raised their hand. Yes.
Thanks. This talks give a lot of insights and inspirations to me. My name is Mardatila from Landesa, Indonesia. In Indonesia, we are now also has been a lot of many years working and revising the law on forestry. And I would just like to ask your opinion on what you think about, because there are some idea to also fight on the redefining what is forest. Yeah. So I give the credits to late professor. His name is Haryadi Kartodiharjo in Indonesia. So we were formulating, instead of using the FAO definition, the definition of forest is as an ecosystem comprising a landscape rich in biodiversity that has been formed naturally or through social processes, dominated by year-round vegetation within a natural, environmental, spiritual, and cultural context, which are inseparable from one another and function as a source of food and water and source of various and energy and knowledge. So how to put forest as into, at the same time, functioning as a source of all of these elements. So if there is no knowledge in it, so it's also not forest. So to exclude also palm oil plantation, for example, and other monoculture crops. Yeah. I just wonder if any thoughts, any similar actions are happening also outside Indonesia. Thanks.
I'm gonna pass on to the table, but just if there is no knowledge, there is no forest is something. I really love the sentence. I'm writing it down, keeping for the next places in life. If you want, any of you want to comment?
For me, you can discuss it in the coffee.
Other countries also having some struggles on that.
Yeah, I'm also thinking on one of the results of the COP30 was the forest roadmap. Yeah. And could be a good also pathway, could be a good tool for all of us to really talk about forest in a biophysical, but also political and economical concept, as a global, mainly as a global south, but as a global community, but if we do not take this as an opportunity to really have this kind of more deep conversations, and could only be, again, a new beautiful document to be, as many of us have seen. And the law is different. Yeah. And so how to really bring these discussions, but to something meaningful. When in Brazil, we do not call forest anymore, we call native vegetation, because we have 5 biomes, and there's a huge fight. But again, forest and native vegetation, and by framing this, putting this into the technical biophysical concept, but trying to bring, and this is sometimes is the stick, sometimes is the carrot, so the legislation needs to try to bring both, and so beyond the concept, I think how to really guarantee that, and that it will be economically and politically understood and internalized into the, and again, back into forest, independently of the native vegetation concept, in a broader way, we have the beautiful forest code. I don't know how much have you heard about that. It's a wonderful legislation. Could be better, but it's, considering nowadays, it's a wonderful legislation. I know we try to. And with many of these sticks and carrots and concepts, but it's still less than 10% of what was described in the law. It was launched in 2008, was implemented by today. So the law, the concepts, the incentives, the sticks needs to be there, but we really, really need urgently go into the implementation mode.
I might just add briefly, I mean, what a crucial opportunity to redefine forests, and what an important lawmaking moment. And I really liked, as you did, I really liked the definition that you gave. I mean, a couple things that I liked about it. It was in plain language, as opposed to legalese. Like, we could understand what you were saying. It emphasized the role of people in the forest. It doesn't just talk about it as something that is separate from human beings. And then I love, like you did, I love the line about knowledge. So for example, an oil palm plantation, you're saying that can't be a forest. So I love that definition. I think I would just emphasize what Fabíola was saying, is that good laws don't implement themselves. Yes. And it relates to what our friend from Ecuador was saying as well. Like, they won the referendum, they've got a strong constitution, and so it's just so crucial. I was talking about the legal empowerment cycle, and the reason I think of it as a wheel, no law, use law that we have, imperfect as those laws may be, try to build from those cases to shape law. The reason it's not just a one-way street, the reason it's a wheel, is because when you do get a policy win, like that landmark law in Brazil, it doesn't implement itself. Like, we need to breathe life into those new laws. And so I would say, like, just involving the people whose lives are at stake, both in coming up with the right definitions and the right provisions, so the lawmaking process, the top of the cycle, but then also crucially, once you have it, and it will be imperfect, because lawmaking is always an imperfect process, some things will get negotiated out. Once you have it, though, really breathing life into it by educating people and involving people to invoke it to solve concrete problems. That's how we bring law to life. And Indonesia has a really rich history of legal empowerment and community paralegals. One of the leading members of our network is LBHI, which has like a nationwide network of community paralegals. And so I think, doing everything you can to involve people in the formation, and then really put that law into the hands of people who need it once it passes, so that we don't have, how many years has it been since the Brazilian?
2008,
14. I cannot count the number of land laws around the world where that's the case, where it was passed in 97, and yet less than 10% of communities who, in theory, have tenure protection under the law have actually been able to avail of that. I cannot count the number of countries where that's the case, and we need to really breathe life into laws with urgency.
Love it.
I would just a small comment on that we have the same case in Brazil, as Vivek was saying. Good laws don't implement themselves, and it's a big challenge. The forest code is one of them. The forest management law is another one. Basically, what we do at Amazônia de Pé is try to reinforce that this bill from 2006 gets implemented. So we're talking about a 20-year law that has still not been implemented. And how can we do it? Through social mobilization and advocacy and pressure towards our Congress, towards our Supreme Court, towards our government. I think it's a big challenge. After we build a good law, the second biggest challenge is to implement it.
Absolutely.
And I don't see ways of doing it without people powering and people getting together to demand it to be implemented. You. And then the last one will be there. Yeah.
We are seeing.
Yeah. It's because they were in the first, and you will be the last one.
Hello, Julia Christian from the NGO Fern in Brussels. So we work on EU policy. So I have a question about what is the potential, particularly in Brazil and Indonesia, in the discussions around social bioeconomy, of agricultural subsidy reform as a way to sort of bring some of those activities from the marginal into the mainstream. And I'm saying that because we're interested at looking in Europe at how to build a European social bioeconomy. And in that sense, I would slightly disagree. I do think Europe should be part of the forest roadmap, but to discuss our own land use. I think there's a perception that we have no problems, which is promoted by the European logging industry. It's not true. We used to have massive forests. We destroyed them. What we have left, we manage very badly. And I think there could be a bit more attention, actually, on that and less hypocrisy from Europe sometimes. But anyway, that aside, I wanted to know, because in Europe we've got a big agricultural subsidy program, and it completely props up and shapes all of the land use in Europe to the extent that there's no free market to speak of when it comes to trade in sort of bio-based products. And I wondered if that's also the case in Brazil or Indonesia. How important are agricultural subsidies in shaping what is profitable, and what's the potential for trying to redirect some of that funding towards socially positive activities?
Do you want to maybe take all
Yeah,
the
can I
ones?
have the last one, his, and then we'll answer the two of them?
And then do our
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. So first of all, fantastic session today. It's been heartwarming, inspiring to hear the local empowerment using data and the power of law. So that's fantastic. I'm a founder of a climate fund venture studio. So we build companies in the climate space in Southeast Asia and India. And so we look for commercial opportunities where we can mitigate huge carbon sequestration and also mitigation. And in Southeast Asia, about 50% of the carbon impact is from agri-food and also land use change. And so we try to marry up the commercial opportunity with the ability to kind of impact carbon in one way, and also livelihoods as a secondary impact. And so one of the things we've been challenged with is seeing massive carbon sink depletion from land grabbing, from encroachment. You know, we've seen a 66%, I think, increase in deforestation in Indonesia in the last 12 months. And not surprisingly, because you've got demand for biofuels, you've got demand for nickel mining, you've got demand for agri-food as well. So you've got this commercial pressure to turn the land into for other uses. But at the same time, which, you want to try and protect that land, but at the same time, the local communities, you want to increase the prosperity and livelihoods of the local communities. So are there any examples of, either in Brazil or in Southeast Asia, where we've had commercial opportunities, business models that can, on the one hand, preserve and conserve forestry, at the same time empower and also increase the livelihoods of the local communities?
Yeah.
Vivek, and then...
Or, yeah, after.
No.
Whichever order. Okay. And should this kind of be our final word?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm going to ask them to answer both of those questions and also do final remarks. And on your final remarks, I just wanted to hear a little bit from you on the importance of us as civil society and institutions to collaborate across countries, especially in those times where multilateral institutions are being really questioned. What is our role as civil society to work together? And then we can answer both of them and do final remarks, please. You can start, Vivek.
Great, yeah. I love the questions about agricultural subsidies and about economic models. I mean, I loved what you said, Fabíola, about the bioeconomy. I think ultimately we need to place economic value on forests, and we have not been doing that adequately. I will just tell a brief story about one way in which this can show up, which is carbon payments. And we came to that because communities were responding to carbon projects. And many times carbon projects have reproduced some of the exploitative behaviors that extractive industries have had, land grabbing, all kinds of terrible things. Don't even get me started. Zimbabwe announced at one of the earlier COPs that they were dedicating a fifth of the landmass of the country to a carbon project run right by UAE Blue, which is like a petrostate company. And they didn't say which fifth. There is no fifth of Zimbabwe that's unpopulated. That is a land grab. They didn't show a map. So there's been a lot of problems, but it was coming up from communities. And so we started by just educating ourselves and our network members. We have network members around the world about how this market works. And we actually had a convening. It culminated with a convening in Indonesia that was hosted by LBHI. And there's a divergence of opinion. Like in our grassroots justice network, there's a divergence of opinion about carbon markets. We had like a spectrum where we said, if you think this is mostly a threat, stand over here. And if you think that there's like promise, the promise might outweigh the danger, stand over there. People were all across the room. Actually, the Indonesians tended to be over here, in part because of the history of RED, if people are familiar with that, where it was sort of used as a ruse for land grabbing. But honestly, people were all across the room. There were a lot of folks on that end of the room. There were many people in the middle. We were able to reach consensus. Despite that diversity of opinion, we reached consensus around 6 carbon justice principles that if those markets are going to exist, we need these principles in order for them to be fair. And so even the folks who are kind of anti-carbon payment, they were like, yes, we need those principles for sure. And so we've been campaigning collectively to get those principles incorporated into the rules that govern these markets. And no law, use law, shape law, like growing out of the experience of communities who've been responding to these projects, who've been negotiating deals. And we had a breakthrough in December where Verra, which is the certifier for the majority of the private carbon market, I mean, I think they especially were persuaded by the grounded experience of communities actually responding to these. And they, in a rewrite of their social environmental standard, we were able to incorporate a number of our core demands. So requiring free, prior, informed consent of communities whose land it is in question, requiring a portion of revenue sharing with communities under a binding contract, which often previously did not exist, and requiring transparency. Like that was one of the basic things, is that companies would not disclose. They'd say, oh, we'll give you these benefits, but they wouldn't disclose how much they were actually bringing in. And so requiring that transparency, which is the basis of a contract. We also in December supported communities to sign a deal in Sierra Leone. To your point about like examples of economic models, 79,000 hectares, so nearly 200,000 acres of mangrove forests. The communities are going to be in a leadership role in conserving the mangroves. They're going to use cook stove, because they do cut, they value the mangroves, but they also cut the mangroves to smoke fish. So they're going to use electric stoves to smoke fish without cutting the mangroves. And they're going to receive 40% of gross revenue over 50 years. 40% of gross revenue we were able to negotiate. And that's projected to be at least $50 million over 25 years. These are some of the poorest people in the world off the coast of Sierra Leone, and those are like significant resources. And if you compare in Sierra Leone, for example, and many countries, for mining, there's a community development fund for mining. I don't know about other places. In Sierra Leone, it's 1%. 1% of revenue goes to local communities for development when they extract minerals. This is 40%, and instead of allowing your land to be destroyed, you are actually able to preserve your land. So I think that if done fairly, we need to structure a way of paying for these commons, which are precious to the people they live in, but they are precious to all of us. And structuring those in a way that is fair, that allows the communities whose land it is to be in the driver's seat. And to be able to lead projects like these. So if you go to grassrootsjusticenetwork.org, you can join. I hope all of you will join. But also there's a sort of page about the Carbon Justice Campaign to learn more about this.
Perfect. Thank you, Vivek. You can go, Emily.
Yeah, I don't have much to say to those two really great questions. So anyway, we'll do. Yeah, but in terms of collaboration, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about forests, and I just I love that definition. I mean, it's just like, because a forest is an ecosystem. A forest is not a monoculture. It is a rich where all the different plants and animals and pollinators and soil and air and water and humans and are all collaborating in this beautiful way where there is no hero. There might be like some taller species, but like everything is working together, and it has a spirit and an energy and a wisdom. And so I think I've been thinking about that when it comes to like NGOs and civil society and how we are all like, because there are bigger threats against forest. There's such big threats against forests. So we all have to be working together. We have to mimic the forest, and we do our best work when we mimic the forest. And I think there's a reason all of us have community empowerment at the center of our work, as has been named, and the fight is global, and we have global technology that's connecting us, that's allowing us to communicate with each other, and so we can be learning from each other, and that's been happening. So, a lot of our growth as an organization has happened because people saw the wins that some of our early partners had, and then they were like, we want to do the same, and we've done. There's many other groups that bring people together to share, and when Indigenous leaders are coming together and sharing those stories, beautiful things are happening. I'll just end with a really cool project that I'm excited about. I mean, it's very inspiring to hear that final bit. We've seen a lot of negative examples of carbon, and also carbon often requires like things that are not in right relationship with what the land needs. Right. So I also think there's an opportunity for biodiversity monitoring, like biodiversity credits. To support Indigenous peoples. And so we've got a few different partners in Kenya and Thailand who are doing really cool work along with Forest Peoples Program to do Indigenous-led biodiversity monitoring that centers Indigenous wisdom, but is also bringing in insight from outside, biologists and experts. And then what are the ways that technology used in the right way might be able to support communities for there to be financing to keep that biodiversity, to protect forest standing. So I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities, and I'll pass to you.
Thank you. I think that we have the three issues about the collaborating and connecting the collaboration in the world. About in Indonesia, like Indonesia, we need still to securing the tenure for Indigenous people's rights. I think because in the past we launched about the indicative map of the Indigenous peoples is 70 million hectares. So until now, we just have the 36 million hectares. So we need big homework to continue about the indigenous mapping. And the second, like I mentioned about the conflict, the land conflict is still the criminalization indigenous people still going now. And I think, and also about I found in the concession business in indigenous peoples, indigenous territories is 7 million hectares. So this is from mining, plantation, palm oil, and also the restoration ecosystem permit. This is, I think, the green grabbing, because they just continue shifting the concession from the palm oil concession and sometimes palm logging. They're shifting to restoration ecosystem permit. This is, I think, that's still problem about the rights of the indigenous people. Sometimes that's the green, the company. But actually there's a green grabbing because they continue about the permit. Just shifting the commodity from palm oil, from logging to carbon like that. So I think we need to address this issue. And the second about the economic development. We have 7 million hectares already recognized by local government. But how the economic impact after recognition? This is also the homework for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Big 42 seconds to talk about and I really like it, the point that you brought. And the main problem of deforestation in my country is still the land cost of opportunity. The land cost of opportunity is still in favor of deforestation instead of conservation. It's still in favor of deforestation instead of restoration. It's pretty much more profitable plant soy than restore or conserve. And we are bringing the carbon and the ecosystem services to try to balance a little bit the cost of opportunity. This is the knowledge, but first, it's still not enough. Second, who is doing that? Who is winning the money? And this is why the social is so important into the bioeconomy. It's not only about bioeconomy itself, it's social. Like, this is very important to be reframed, And this is why it's so important that the governments, that the public policies looks at this and try to regulate a little bit. Because if you leave to the free market, it will not work. The conversion, the cost of opportunity was still in favor of conversion. The cost of opportunity was still in favor of the carbon that it's concentrated or do not really know like benefit sharing that we are here defending and trying to build. So, for instance, I was in the environmental ministry before we started to work in Conexsus, and we tried to put in the public rural credit policy, which calls Plano Safra, is the biggest in the world. Brazil has the biggest rural credit public policy. We try to put those who is respecting the forest code will have a rate decreased by 0.5, you know? And we had a huge discussion, huge, 0.5, you know, it's like that, now it's not too much. And a huge discussion, okay, how can I will really trace all of this, how can I will prove it, etc. But in the end, this kind of, you know, like the rural policies or the subsidies, they are there. This is a main pillar of the Brazilian macroeconomy, the agribusiness sector, no? But agribusiness will not exist if we do not care in terms of the whole climate regulation that needs to come from restore, and all conservation and etc. So it's the question will not close, but the governments, the public policies, and us, and the philanthropists, we do have a huge role to really absorb this kind of risk, because the market will not. For them, you know, like risk is only financial risk, and this is not. I think we need here. We really are the ones who can change this, collaborating again.
Guys, I wanted to thank you, all of you, for coming here today. Please feel free to connect to all these amazing institutions to support their work, and I hope that we'll keep working together to push for forest protection that centers communities and that guarantees a possible future for all of us and our future ones that will come. Thank you so much, and have a good Skoll Forum.
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you.